Something had changed within Valdus. It was undeniable, and also incredibly inconvenient. For time immeasurable, he had witnessed the endless cycle of humanity. Their rise, their fall, and their rebirth played out time and time again. Despite the fact that they simply refused to learn from their mistakes, human beings were far more tenacious and persistent than he had initially given them credit for. No matter how close they came to extinction, and that last time they really had come so very close, they always found a way to scratch and claw their way back from the brink. It was from the long game that Valdus had always derived the most pleasure. The fleeting nature of a mortal life, combined with their jealousy, greed and pride, had always made people desperately malleable and easy to manipulate. There had never been anything more satisfying than simply waiting patiently for a carefully constructed plan to come to fruition. Valdus had corrupted the powerful and sown the seeds of discord that would eventually break the bonds of both family and friendship. Without lifting a single finger, he had destroyed entire communities from the shadows. Why was it then that a mere 6 months after his triumphant arrival at the Cove, that he was already almost unbearably bored? The game he had played in Huxley had been fun. The people who had made that valley their home were simple-minded and good-natured, which had made it incredibly easy to insert himself into their ranks all those years ago. A few small tricks. That was all it had taken to have them eating out of the palm of his hand. They had turned to him for advice, for comfort, for wisdom, and he had watched as their admiration for him grew and grew. In the end, they had respected, even loved him, and that had made the grand finale all the sweeter. But maybe he had simply waited too long. Perhaps his restless disquiet was caused, at least in part, by the gnawing frustration that he had unfinished business, a rare loose end. The plan had always been that when the time came to leave Huxley behind, Valdus would orchestrate its utter destruction. And even though almost everything fell perfectly into place, Valdus was forced to admit that even he was unable to always plan for every contingency. The Fletcher boy had been away during those final days, and whilst his absence had been a source of immense irritation at first, in the end it had been the true crowning stroke. For just one man to survive, especially one who was destined for a seat of power, was poetic. One lonely survivor, left behind to bear witness to the events that had taken place and keep their memory alive. It was magnificent. The thought of that one lonely survivor returning home to find nothing but death and destruction had amused Valdus, and so he had designed a masterpiece, a paragon of turpitude that would haunt them until their dying day. Desiring the fruits of his labour, Valdus had waited a fortnight in that silent necropolis for the boy's return, and in that time he had never quite decided whether or not he would deliver the coup de grace, or allow Fletcher to live on in never-ending misery. The sudden onset of winter, with its heavy snowfall, the cold and the quiet, had made Valdus impatient, and in the end he had decided to move on. But still, he hoped that Fletcher was out there somewhere, seeking revenge, and that one day they would meet again, so he could finally tie up that loose end. It felt to Valdus that he had simply swapped one quiet, primitive corner of the world for another, and traded farmers for fishermen. At least the people of Huxley had been interesting, with all their superstitions, traditions, and a high council to manipulate. But the Cove was utterly uninspiring. Its inhabitants were too few in number for any elaborate subterfuge to take place. They were crude and unsophisticated. They moved from one day to the next like witless animals with no ambition or imagination to speak of. There was no fun to be had here, and it was taking every ounce of patience that Valdus had left to not slaughter the entire settlement and move on to somewhere less mundane. Yes, that would be easy, and it would satisfy his urges for now, but it would not solve the problem altogether. It was with all of this running through his mind that Valdus found himself waiting in the Cove's communal building. Due to recent events, the leader of the settlement, John, had called for an emergency meeting, and this, at least, might provide a modicum of entertainment. The rickety tables had been pushed against the walls. Chairs were laid out in disorderly rows, and the air was filled with a nervous tension. To the left of Valdus sat Arya, the quiet girl whose mother had been killed on the night of the raid, which had provided an excellent pretext for his continued residency. Valdus was a man who had lost his family to the marauders who had killed Arya's mother, and the fact that the two of them would form such a strong bond made sense. That simple fiction, combined with his heroic intervention, had led to the Cove dwellers quickly accepting him as one of their own. All except for John. And there was something keen-eyed and perceptive about the broad-shouldered leader, an intelligence that his people did not possess. Although the initial deception had worked perfectly, over the last few months John's attitude towards Valdus had become increasingly glacial and aloof. There was a primal mistrust that Valdus suspected even John did not fully understand. The cunning theatrics designed to endear himself to the others and prevent John from ousting him had been the one distraction Valdus had been able to find, and without it, he would almost certainly have run out of patience months ago. The hushed murmuring of those in attendance halted abruptly as John took his place before them. The summer sun had darkened his weather-beaten skin, but the rich glow of his tan still failed to conceal his weary pallor. There was an anxious quality to his newly shortened curls, as though he had run his hand through them 1,000 times. His clothes were creased and unkempt, and there was dark circles beneath his eyes. In truth, it looked as though he had aged 10 years in the last 6 months, and Valdus struggled to conceal the amusement he felt at the shell of a man preparing to address this pitiful crowd. "As you all know, our situation is dire," John rumbled gravely. "Well, that's an understatement," an older man in the front row scoffed, before falling silent under the weight of John's belligerent stare. "We have lost many people over these last few months," John continued as though there had been no interruption. "Most were killed during the raid. But it seems that this land has become dangerous. So far, 10 of us have been killed or gone missing, and a few have left voluntarily. I don't think that it's an exaggeration to say that if this continues, our community is in danger of falling apart." Valdus mirrored the worried expression everybody else was wearing, but he felt a mounting sense of irritation. Too easy. This was far too easy. Could the loss of 10 and the departure of maybe half that number really be enough to bring this community to its knees? It occurred to him then that in his small attempts to escape the clutches of his unrest, he may have brought the game to a natural conclusion without intending to. Perhaps he had been more active than he felt he had. Too easy. Why must it be so easy? John's face suddenly filled with emotion, and he bowed his head, taking a moment to gather himself before continuing. It is with a heavy heart I must tell you we have lost another. This morning I found Edmund just over an hour away. I will not speak of what I saw, but believe me when I say that some new evil stalks this land, and its brutality is almost enough to strike me dead. It's clear that we are all in danger, and I know that you look to me for answers, but I have none. I'm sorry, but I am lost, and it's as a community that we must decide what to do next." "I don't believe this," one of the fishermen roared as he leapt to his feet. "You meant to be in charge, John. You meant to protect us, and all you do is offer empty words. The gates are not enough. We need arming. We need to fight for what's ours." "Arming against what?" John asked quietly in reply. "You know exactly what against," the fisherman hissed with a step towards John. "I've told you my thoughts a dozen times, and yet you refuse to open your eyes and see what's plain to me." "You've told me your thoughts a dozen times," John growled, "and I've told you what I think of your suggestion. This is not the work of the Queen Regnant. We are far beyond the borders of the so-called settled lands, and even if she's expanding, why would she target our community specifically? Do you seriously think they've heard of these parts in Alborough? And do you really think they'd care if they had? Even if they did, why would they operate with stealth rather than sending a garrison to conscript us? We've all heard tales of the butcheries committed by her armies when she's seeking new territory. They do not hide in the shadows and pick people off quietly. If you can stand there with a straight face and tell me you think this is royal business, then you're an idiot, Thomas." Valdus could hardly believe his ears. John had said Halborough. That was a name Valdus hadn't heard in a very long time, and it piqued his interest. So, as the two men continued their argument, he felt his mind begin to wander. A queen. The so-called settled lands. Fascinating. How long had it been since the reclamation was first proposed? In those days, Halborough had been nothing more than a dream, and a far-fetched, fanciful dream at that. There had been no more than 400 people, and they had been disorganized, prone to bickering amongst themselves. But perhaps Valdus had been wrong to dismiss their attempts at reclaiming what nature had taken as foolish. If a monarch was stationed there, with enough power and influence to conquer and claim foreign lands, then Halborough must have come far indeed. The concept of an entire city to play with was incredibly enticing. Humanity had existed in isolated pockets for so long that Valdus had almost forgotten the endless possibilities offered by a thriving metropolis. The greed, the corruption, the unbridled debauchery. It really had been too long. How could he possibly have allowed himself to become so distracted? How many years had he wasted living in the wilderness, playing petty, inconsequential games with naive and simple-minded peasants when there was an entire kingdom ready and waiting for his arrival? How many opportunities had he squandered? "This is pointless!" came an angry voice from beside Valdus. Turning, he saw Arya standing with her fists clenched and a defiant expression upon her face. Well, well, here at last was a pleasant surprise. Of all the people in attendance, Arya was the last person in the room Valdus would have expected an outburst from. Over the last few months, she had been timid and reserved, a convenient but ultimately vapid piece of the puzzle. The bond the two of them had formed had been a nice addition to the backstory Valdus had created, and the pathos it injected had only made it more believable. Proof, if any was needed, that empathy was a dangerous weakness that made people all too easy to exploit. Very few things took Valdus by surprise, and yet there was apparently some hidden substance to this girl that he had missed so far.
What kind of leader are you? To not have the answers now when it actually matters. We need somewhere else to live before it's too late, and you know that,
she stated in a quiet but confident voice that Valdis had never heard her use before. You're not wrong, Arya, John replied solemnly. I know I should have the answers, but I don't. And a true leader isn't afraid to admit when they don't know what to do. Now anyone who wishes to leave is welcome to. I won't stop you. But I will not abandon my home. Our home. I was born here and I will die here. I'll not be driven out by any evil.
I know what my decision is. I won't stay here to die.
What exactly would your plan be? John asked evenly. Do you know how to hunt? How to fish? How to prepare food? What would you do for warmth and shelter? How would you earn money to trade? I know it's not what you want to hear, but I promised your mother I'd look after you. When the day comes that I know you can provide for and protect yourself, you'll be free to go. But that day is not today, Arya. You might not understand that. You might even hate me for it, but I will keep my promise. Valdis watched with fascination as Arya stood there with her nails digging into the palms of her tightly clenched fists. The room was silent, and it looked as though Arya was fighting an internal battle, as if she had something to say. But then she simply turned and walked purposefully past the rows of chairs towards the door. I hope one day you'll see I'm only trying to do what's right, John called as she walked away. For a fraction of a second she paused with her hand upon the doorframe, and it looked as though she was considering turning back. But then, with a small shake of her head, she continued out into the cove. Valdis got to his feet and followed. The rest of the meeting would consist of nothing but mindless fools squabbling amongst themselves like children, and to stay would be pointless. It was plain to see that nobody else was going to leave, not when John had given them multiple chances to do so over the last few months. That man was the biggest fool of them all, because he couldn't see that in their eyes all of their troubles were caused by his ineptitude. They needed something to blame, and he was the most logical choice. That was just human nature. Those who remained were more likely to slit his throat and seize control, rather than give up their comfortable lives and risk the unknown wilderness. Arya barely spared him a glance as he fell into step beside her, and together the two of them walked slowly down to the cove's rocky shore. The air was thick and humid, with ominous storm clouds gathering on the horizon, like an army preparing for its final onslaught against its enemy, as they stood staring out over the ocean. A silence filled with anticipation hung between them. Valdis could see the cogs of the girl's mind turning, as she chewed her lip anxiously and shuffled her feet, waiting for whatever it was he had to say. Would he admonish or validate her outburst? It was interesting to see that she cared so much what he thought, when she had stood against John so defiantly. I'm proud of you, he said simply, and the girl smiled as a light breeze blew her auburn hair away from her face. I thought you might be mad, she replied quietly, and Valdis offered her a warm smile of his own. No, Arya, I'm not mad. He paused, as if in hesitation, as though he wasn't quite sure whether or not to say what was on his mind. I'm sure John is a good man, who wants the best for his people, but I also think he's lost his way. The cove is sheltered and isolated, but simply building gates isn't enough to protect us from a world that becomes ever more dangerous. Communities like this are always in danger from people who do not share their values or want what they have. We can't just lock the gates and expect the outside world to leave us be. In fact, The very existence of the gates advertises that there is something of value behind them. This might have been a safe place in times gone by, but some evil has clearly come here, and I don't feel safe. If I could, I would choose to leave, because finding a new place to live is the smartest move, but John is too stubborn to see that. Arya, you can see what he cannot, and it showed great bravery and strength of will to stand up for what you know is right, and that is why I am proud of you. If your parents were here, I'm sure they would feel the same way.
Then you should leave, before it's too late, Arya replied despondently, as she sent a stone skimming into the ocean. Valdus cast his eyes back towards the horizon and the gathering storm clouds.
It's not as simple as that,
he said, before skimming a stone of his own.
How could I leave in good conscience, knowing that nobody here would keep you safe? I failed my family, Arya. I wasn't there to protect them, and I don't want to fail again.
There was a long silence then, filled only by the rhythmic ambience of the ocean and a soft plip, 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 as they took turns sending their stones dancing across the water's surface until they disappeared into the murky depths below. Valdus watched as a kaleidoscope of emotions cycled its way across Arya's face. Peaceful reservation, giving way to a sadness that built through irritation to a crescendo of bitter resentment, before morphing into an uncontainable rage. Finally, she hurled a stone with all her might before releasing a guttural scream and falling to her knees. "I miss them both," she whimpered, as she stared up at Valdus with a heartbroken expression, before furiously swiping her tears away. "I miss them, and I love them, but I hate them too. I hate them for dying, I hate those men for killing my mum, and I hate myself for being too small and weak to help. I hate John for not having the answers, and for not being able to protect us. I feel... Sometimes I'm afraid of everything. I'm even afraid of myself. But the way that I feel inside, and I don't know what to do."
"Listen to me,"
Valdus told her, as he knelt and put a gentle hand upon her shoulder.
"What you are feeling is natural. Grief is a terrible burden to bear. It is a tempest that rips through us. It carries away everything that is beautiful and good. It destroys our foundations and leaves behind only the wreckage of the life that we once lived. We can rebuild ourselves from the debris, but we can never put the pieces back exactly as they were. You will get through this, Arya. I will make sure of that. And when we're done rebuilding you, I promise you will feel stronger than you did before. I told you that you can see what John cannot, and so can I, because he is short-sighted and we are not. Where he can only see a helpless child, I see somebody with potential. One day you could be the leader of your own community, Arya. I can teach you how to survive, how to protect yourself, and make sure the world never takes anything you're not willing to give. How to wield authority and command respect. With my guidance, you will never need to feel afraid again."
After taking a moment to quietly process what he'd said, Arya offered a nod of approval, and seeing that the tears were gone now, replaced by an expression of staunch determination, Valdus smiled in return. This was good. As the dark shadow on the horizon crept ever closer, swallowing the sky and obscuring the warm glow of the sun, a plan was crystallizing in his mind, and he knew exactly what he needed to do. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure disappear, moving past the weather-worn houses and back into the cove. Things were finally getting interesting. It was 3 hours later, as Valdus was making his way to the communal hall for the evening meal, that John finally confronted him. Valdus laughed inwardly at the sight of this weary-looking fool, leaning against a wall, desperately trying to project an air of confidence and authority as he raised an open palm to signal that Valdus should halt his approach. In a way, it was surprising that this hadn't happened earlier, but by waiting until now, John had ensured that there would be no witnesses to what was about to transpire. It was a relatively clever move, but the bravado he was attempting to muster was still hilariously ineffective, and it was with a snide sense of glee that Valdus noted he looked even more haggard than he had during that morning's meeting.
"I want you gone," John growled as he drew closer.
"I had a feeling you were going to say that," Valdus replied.
"I don't like you, and I don't trust you. Now, I was grateful for your actions on the night you arrived, and I still am, but that doesn't change the fact that you don't belong here. I know you must miss your family, but you can't turn Arya into a surrogate daughter. It's not right. I was raised to trust my instincts, and they're telling me you're no good for that girl, so I want you gone."
"Okay," Valdus replied simply, feeling a smug sense of satisfaction at John's double take. "You're right, John. I don't belong here. I recognize a good man when I see one, and I know you want what's best for your people. I've acted selfishly and irresponsibly trying to replace my grace with Arya. It isn't fair on either girl, so when the storm passes, I'll slip out quietly and leave this place behind." John fixed him with a long, searching look before nodding solemnly and turning to walk away. After taking a few steps, he turned back.
"Are you coming?"
he asked. "I don't think that's a good idea. I think I should keep my distance from Arya. I'm going to get my things ready for travel so I can leave before she notices. I can't bear to say goodbye, John. I know that she'll hate me, but it's for the best."
"You're doing the right thing,"
John said softly, before turning on his heel and walking quickly in the direction of the communal building. Valdus stood with his head bowed until he was sure the other man had gone, and then he turned, smiled to himself, and began walking in the opposite direction to get the things he needed. Night had fallen by the time the deluge began. The cove was empty and silent, with its inhabitants huddled indoors for warmth and shelter. Wind whipped around the houses, howling its melancholy chorus into the darkness, and the ocean had become a frenzied beast that savaged the coast with unrelenting ferocity. Booming thunder rolled over the landscape menacingly, and lightning blazed across the sky as John lay upon his bed in the clutches of some unknown terror. The world around him was distorted and hazy, as though objects had somehow started to lose their tangibility and were now melting into one another. Every breath was laboured, searing pain ripped repeatedly through his abdomen. It felt like there was fire raging through his veins, and the pounding of his heart only amplified its intensity. In all his life, John had never felt so helpless and afraid. There was nothing he could do to stop whatever was happening to him. Movement was almost impossible, and even if he could find the strength to cry out for help, who would hear him over the storm? Death was approaching. He could feel it, creeping insidiously towards him, coming to claim his soul. Time was unravelling. Consciousness was elusive. John couldn't even begin to imagine how long he'd been lying there, fighting the irresistible urge to just let go, to drift, to be at peace. It was with a dim shred of hope that he heard the door creak open as somebody entered the room, but something wasn't right. There was no cry of alarm and no urgency to their approach. Instead, their steps were slow and purposeful, as they made their way across the room before taking a seat on the bed beside him. "Focus, John. I know it's hard, but you have to try. It isn't time to leave yet," a familiar voice whispered softly in his ear. Feeling like he was wading back through deep water, John struggled to comply, but with a great effort he finally forced his eyes to open. The room was a swirl of dancing shadows, as warm light grappled with the encroaching darkness. A figure loomed above him, and as he caught sight of them they leaned closer. The face of Valdus Doyle slowly came into focus, a devilish grin illuminating his features.
"I had to come and say goodbye," Valdus told him softly. "Oblivion awaits your arrival, but it can wait a little longer. I'm not done with you yet."
Keeping his cold eyes fixed on John's, Valdus watched as the dying man desperately struggled to form words.
"Oh, John, you poor fool," Valdus cooed mockingly. "You must be so confused, so afraid. Not to worry, I'm here now and I can help clear things up. I confess, this isn't usually how I like to do things. I prefer something more visceral. But after our little discussion earlier, I decided it was for the best. I'm afraid I lied, John. I know it's a bad habit. But when you left me, I didn't go and quietly pack my things as I said I would. No. Instead, I let myself in here and I left something in this."
With a derisive laugh, Valdus held up an empty wine bottle for John to see, before tucking it beneath his cloak.
"Perhaps if you were accustomed to drinking anything that didn't taste foul to start with, you might have noticed, but clearly you didn't. I have to admit, I wasn't expecting you to drink the entire thing, but considering the stress you've been under recently, it's hardly surprising. Such a cliché, John. You're not the first man to hit the bottle in an attempt to hide from his troubles, and you won't be the last."
John choked and spluttered as he fought with every fibre of his being to do something. To move, to lash out, to scream. But it was useless. His body was entirely outside of his control. Valdus watched as blood trickled from the wretched man's lips and could not contain his glee.
"You're a man of convictions, aren't you, John? I could see that from the start. You're a good man, but do you know the problem with good men? They expect evil to arrive cloaked in darkness and plain to see. They never recognize the evil that shakes their hand with a smile."
Valdus leaned back with a snide chuckle, and as he did so the shadows about the two men deepened and pushed forward. The lantern light danced as though buffeted by a strong wind. It spluttered, was almost extinguished, but somehow it endured. Its now feeble glow barely pierced the darkness surrounding it, and with a terrible certainty John knew that it could not persist for much longer. The man beside him, if he was a man at all, placed a hand gently upon his cheek, and John felt an intense heat radiate from the point of contact. It spread quickly over his entire body until it felt like flames were licking at his skin, and still, his scream of anguish would not come.
"You looked me in the eye and you didn't see it. You welcomed me with open arms and sealed your fate," Valdus hissed disdainfully. "You were blinded by your gratitude when I rode to the rescue of your pathetic little settlement, as I knew you would be when I orchestrated the attack. Predictable. Men like you are so predictable. I did, however, make a rare miscalculation when we first met, and I'll admit that. I assumed you would be a worthy adversary, but you disappointed me. You're more perceptive than the others, I'll give you credit for that. You never fully trusted me, but you still couldn't put the pieces together, still couldn't see the bigger picture. Even as I butchered your people one by one, you never suspected me, and it was easy. I brought your community to its knees without even trying, simply by attempting to keep myself entertained. I don't even know their names. The people that I took from you, I don't even know their names. But it doesn't matter because they're gone, and you will join them soon enough." Convulsions tore through John's body with terrifying force. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, and his entire existence was pain, but he still heard every word. Somehow they pierced the fog that filled his mind, and that was the worst thing of all. A terrible mistake. He had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake, and although he felt he deserved punishment for allowing somebody so grotesque to live amongst them, he didn't want to leave his people to the whims of this vile creature. There must be something he could do, some way to fight this. It couldn't end this way, not when his people were in such grave danger. Valdus leaned forward, so his face was just inches from John's, and his smile was cold and cruel, filled with joy, and yet devoid of any warmth, with not a trace of pity to be found. "I'm so sorry, you'll have to speak up. I can't quite hear what you're trying to say. Perhaps it's my old age," he taunted, with his ear to the dying man's lips. After a moment he pulled away and straightened up, before giving John's shoulder a mocking imitation of a comforting squeeze. "It won't be long now. You can go soon. Off to join your fallen friends. You needn't worry about your people. They're of no consequence to me as long as they behave themselves. I'll be leaving in the morning with dear Arya. What an interesting girl she's turning out to be. I'm afraid I misjudged her the same way I misjudged you. I dismissed her as a simple-minded fool too soon. Gave you too much credit and her too little. I thought she would never amount to anything, but once again, I was wrong. It happens when you live as long as I have. There's darkness in that girl, John. It's lurking just beneath the surface, but I can bring it to the fore. She's balancing on a knife's edge, and all I need to do is give her one little push in the right direction. With you, her life would have been meaningless, but I will unlock her potential, and she will thank me for it. Before long, this place, and the girl she once was, will be nothing but a distant memory." This could not happen. John strained with all his might to fight against the weight pulling him down, 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 into death's waiting embrace. How could it end? People not safe. Arya not safe. Too soon. Not ready. Not ready. Not. Valdus released a long sigh of contentment as he watched John lose the battle little by little, until he slipped into oblivion and fought no more. Usually, poison was his least favourite tool. It was rather impersonal, but experience had taught him it was always better to keep a few things handy for the right occasion, and it had been fun to remove his mask for a while and allow John to see his true self, to send him on his way with the knowledge of what a fool he'd been and what exactly he was leaving behind. In an ideal world, he could have sat and savoured that glorious silence for hours, but it wasn't worth the risk. If the storm caused any unforeseen problems for which John was needed, somebody could come barging in and ruin everything. And so he allowed himself a few quiet moments, before extinguishing the lantern, replacing the empty wine bottle with a fresh one, and striding over to the door, out into the night without a backwards glance. A barrage of wind and rain thrashed at him as he moved his way carefully through the cove. With this weather, at this time of night, detection was unlikely, but the plan was so close to completion that he was unwilling to compromise it in any way. It took almost 10 minutes to make his way to the eastern gate, which he unlocked hastily before tossing the key into the riotous chaos of the ocean, never to be seen again. Smashing the lock with the butt of his knife was much too easy. Pathetic. Did they really think such a hastily built gate could keep out any serious threat? A mildly enraged child could have broken their way through. Resisting the urge to hurry, he made his way back to the ramshackle house that he shared with Arya,
and once he was sure he hadn't been seen, he burst his way through the door and ran to Arya's bedroom. "Wake up, Arya!" he cried happily, before giving her shoulder an excitable shake. The girl rolled over, rubbing her bleary eyes as she looked up at him. "What's going on? Why are you wet?" she asked, but Veldus just offered her a playful smile in return. "I've just been out there," he said with a jerk of his thumb. "I couldn't sleep, but that's not the important part. The storm is beautiful. Come and see." A few minutes later, the two of them ran, lapping through the rain, down towards the ocean. Arya beamed as she drank in the view of the landscape. Lightning flared, thunder rolled, wind lashed rain into her face, and still she beamed. The ocean stretched endlessly into the horizon, and its majestic, untempered beauty took her breath away. "It's amazing!" she yelled happily. "I know!" Veldus bellowed in response. Arya twirled, opening her arms as she gazed up at the sky. The clouds seemed endless, as if this storm were blanketing the entire world, and she wondered how many people were doing the exact same thing as she was at this very moment. Surely she, along with Veldus, could not be the only two people seeking beauty in such conditions. Depending on what a storm signified to them, there would be people praying to their gods in both appreciation and fear, collecting fresh water after a drought, happy families splashing one another. It was incredible that the world could muster such dangerous beauty. It was as she lowered her eyes to scan her surroundings that she saw it, and she was suddenly gripped by an uncontainable fear. The eastern gate was swinging wildly in the wind. The gate was open. "Veldus! Over there!" she screamed as she gestured urgently towards the gate. She saw his brow furrow in concern, and the bubbling joy she'd been feeling just seconds before was gone. Turning on her heel, she sprinted back up the beach, almost slipping on the sodden pebbles, but she didn't care. Somebody had to raise the alarm. Either the storm had broken the gate which left them exposed, or something much worse had happened. The door to Jon's cabin smashed into the wall as Arya burst her way in, but she could instantly tell that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The air was too still, too silent. "Jon?" she whispered into the darkness, but there was no reply. Moving cautiously over to the bed, she froze when she caught sight of him. Jon lay with his body twisted in an unnatural position, blood drying upon his chin, mouth open in a silent scream, and a pained expression etched upon his face. Arya fell to her knees as Veldus came in behind her. "My God," he said quietly as he took in the scene before him. Moving quickly over to pull her away, he crouched down to meet Arya's gaze. "Don't look, Arya, don't look, it's okay," he said. But she began to scream, and pushing him aside, she ran back out into the rain, where she steadied herself against the wall of the cabin, retched, and then vomited. Veldus placed a hand softly upon her shoulder. "He's dead," she spluttered without looking up. "I know. We have to warn the others," he said urgently, and Arya nodded as she straightened up. Without another word, they began to move through the cove, and one by one they woke the others to tell them what they'd found. To the great amusement of Veldus, many people refused to even set foot in Jon's cabin. In the end, things had worked out even better than he expected. Most of the remaining 30 residents felt that this must be the result of some sort of curse. They must have angered the gods in some sort of way, and now they were being punished. Although a few suspected a version of the truth, nobody pointed a finger in his direction. The bonds of trust were completely broken, and they spent the next few hours screaming accusations at one another, deliberating what to do next, and lamenting the loss of their great leader. The fact a number of them had been cursing his name less than 24 hours ago was completely forgotten. They all loved him dearly, this was an unimaginable loss, so on and so forth, blah blah blah.
It was all very boring, and Valdus wished he could just skip ahead to the resolution so that he could stop pretending to care. By the time morning arrived, the storm had calmed to a light drizzle, and everything fell neatly into place. A few people wished to stay, but the majority chose to leave, and it was clear that by the end of the day the cove would be almost deserted. Nobody spared a thought for poor Arya. They were all too concerned with saving their own skin, and Valdus watched as she looked on heartbroken. Eventually, the communal hall was empty except for the two of them. "I'm so sorry for all that you've lost," he said gravely. "Yesterday you said you wanted to find somewhere new to live. If that's still what you want, I believe we should head northeast and make a new life for ourselves in Helborough." "Yes, we should," she replied with a small nod, keeping her eyes downcast. "This place holds nothing but sadness and death. I can't bear to be here for even one more day." "Well then, let's collect our things and move quickly. If we leave by noon, we can cover a few miles and put this place behind us before nightfall. This will be a hard journey, Arya. Uncomfortable. Food will be scarce. We will have to travel through harsh lands. I say this not to scare you, but to prepare you." Taking a deep breath, she raised her head to meet his gaze, and he saw it there. The steel-edged determination. A hint of frozen ground beneath the snow. "I'm ready," she said simply, before rising to her feet, and with her head held high she walked out of the hall in the direction of their cabin. In the end, they took only enough food for a few days, a tent, and some warm clothes for when the seasons changed. It was all they needed. Arya moved with a cold precision, making the conscious choice to leave behind all her belongings, except for a locket passed down by her mother. This was a new start, and she wanted to be reminded of her life here as little as possible. Valdus felt that this was the start of a new long game with all kinds of possibilities. An apprentice was something he hadn't bothered with for a long time, but there was something about Arya that spoke to him on an instinctual level. Kin, recognizing kin. When all was said and done, he would transform this once timid girl into somebody proud and strong, somebody powerful. The air was unseasonably cold as the two of them stepped out of the eastern gate an hour before noon. Arya kept her gaze fixed ahead of her as she strode forward with purpose, refusing to look back, determined to leave it all behind. If she could, she would have stood upon the cliffs overlooking the cove and watched as it all turned to dust. Whether or not they had angered the gods and they were being punished for some unknown crime, that place was cursed and haunted by the ghosts of all the people she had once loved. Were they still out there somewhere? Did they still exist on some distant plane that she too would one day reach? In her heart, Arya did not believe that they did, and so she put one foot in front of the other until the horizon swallowed all traces of her past. What lay ahead she did not know, but whatever it was, she promised herself that she would be ready for it. The world would never again take anything that she wasn't willing to give.